The dog found her first. Jeremiah Winslow had not even finished unloading the second wagon when he heard the deep, resonant sound, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, that told him his enormous, ridiculous, completely undisciplined hound Biscuit had already gotten himself into trouble. He dropped the crate of beekeeping frames he was carrying, let it thud against the dry earth of his new front yard, and jogged around the corner of the stone cottage he had just purchased sight mostly unseen at the edge of the Greywood frontier. What he found stopped him cold. Standing in the narrow gap between his property and the neighboring lot, separated by nothing more than a low, crumbling stone wall threaded with dead vines, was the most fearsome and simultaneously breathtaking woman he had ever laid eyes on in 31 years of living. She was tall, taller than him by a clear 2 inches, with the broad-shouldered, powerful frame of an orc warrior, though she wore no armor. She wore a fitted leather bodice the deep color of charcoal, laced tight up the front with cord the color of old blood, over a form-fitting undershirt of dark burgundy that showed the powerful lines of her arms. Her trousers were sturdy frontier leather, worn soft with use, tucked into knee-high boots. A wide belt cinched everything together at the waist with a carved bone buckle shaped like a thunderhead. Her skin was a rich, deep olive green, her jaw strong and squared, and from the corners of her lower lip jutted 2 ivory tusks, not huge, perhaps 1.5 inches, but pronounced and polished smooth. Her hair was black as pitch, and wound into a thick, heavy braid that hung over one shoulder, threaded with small copper rings. Her eyes were the color of stormy amber, and right now those eyes were directed downward with an expression of absolute, staggering contempt at Biscuit, who was sitting on his haunches at her feet, wagging his tail hard enough to knock a smaller dog off its feet, and staring up at her as though she were made of roasted meat. "Is this yours?" she said. It was not a question. Her voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that carried across a battlefield without being raised, and it had a resonance to it that Jeremiah felt somewhere between his ribs. "He is," Jeremiah said, walking toward her carefully. "I am genuinely sorry. He does not respect boundaries. I have tried everything short of building him a prison." The woman's amber eyes lifted from the dog and landed on Jeremiah. He had the sudden, strange impression of being assessed the way a general assesses terrain, measured, catalogued, and assigned a tactical value. "He sat on my foot," she said. Jeremiah looked down. Biscuit, a shaggy, honey-colored mountain mutt of indeterminate breed who weighed roughly the same as a well-fed calf, had indeed placed his large, warm backside firmly on the woman's left boot and appeared to have no intention of moving. "Biscuit," Jeremiah said. "Off." Biscuit looked at him. He wagged his tail twice, then looked back at the woman. "Biscuit." Jeremiah snapped his fingers. Biscuit made a sound like a small, contented earthquake and leaned his full weight against the woman's leg. For a moment the only sound was the wind moving through the Greywood trees at the property's back edge, a distant crow, and the soft creak of Jeremiah's wagon settling on its wheel. And then the fierce, storm-voiced, amber-eyed orc woman looked down at his ridiculous dog, and the corner of her mouth did something complicated. It was not quite a smile. It was the muscle memory of a smile, fighting its way up through years of not smiling, and losing most of the battle but not quite all of it. "Get him off my foot," she said, and walked back through her gate without another word, latching it behind her with a sharp, final click. Jeremiah stood in the gap between the properties with his dog leaning against his legs. Biscuit had finally moved, apparently satisfied, and stared at the closed gate. A painted board was nailed above it, weathered but legible. It read, "Thunderroar." No other name, just that, as though the name itself was warning enough. He had heard it, of course, before he moved in. You could not buy property on the Greywood frontier without hearing it. The woman who lived in the stone longhouse next to the property he had just purchased had a reputation that stretched from the border garrison town of Ashford all the way to the Orc clan territories in the deep Greywood. Zora Thunderroar, widow of Thunderroar, a clan war leader who had died 6 years ago in a border skirmish that nobody on either side was proud of. She had stayed, had refused to go back to the clan territories when the other orc settlers retreated after the skirmish, had built her longhouse with her own hands, planted her own fields, and reportedly sent 3 separate human men to the healer's house with assorted injuries when they had come to her property in the night with less than peaceful intentions. The garrison at Ashford gave her a wide berth. The merchants in the frontier town of Ridgeback called her by name when she came to trade, without any of the usual slurs, which on the Greywood frontier counted as profound respect. She was, by all accounts, a woman who needed nothing from anyone. Jeremiah Winslow, on the other hand, was a beekeeper who had just moved 200 miles from the settled lowlands with a wagon full of hive frames, a smoker box, 6 months of preserved food, a startling number of jars, and one enormous, boundary-ignoring dog, because he had decided that the limestone-rich soil and flowering forest edge of the Greywood frontier was exactly what his honey production needed, and also because he had been quietly, bone-deep lonely for most of his adult life, and had decided that if he was going to be alone, he might as well be alone somewhere interesting. He had not planned on a neighbor at all. He certainly had not planned on a neighbor like Zora Thunderroar. He stood at the crumbling wall for another long moment, looking at her gate, at the name board above it. Then he picked up Biscuit's lead, snapped it to the dog's collar, and went back to unloading his wagon. The rest of that first week passed in the way of frontier settling, hard, physical, and relentless. Jeremiah set his hive frames in the meadow strip behind his cottage, where the clover grew wild and the linden trees were heavy. He repaired the cottage's south-facing wall, replaced 2 cracked window shutters, dug his water line out from where it had collapsed under the previous owner's neglect, and spent one full memorable morning chasing Biscuit out of the Thunderroar garden after the dog had apparently discovered that her gate latch was within paw's reach of the wall and had let himself in. That particular morning ended with Jeremiah vaulting the crumbling wall, landing in Zora's vegetable garden up to his knees in well-tended herb beds, grabbing his dog by the collar, and coming face to face with Zora Thunderroar, who had emerged from her longhouse's side door with an axe in her hand, which she had clearly been using to split wood before the intrusion. She looked at him. She looked at Biscuit. She looked at the faint paw prints in her herb bed. "You are going to fix that latch," she said. "I will fix the latch," he agreed. He was aware that he was standing in her garden uninvited with a very guilty dog and dirt on his knees, and that she was holding an axe with the easy comfort of long practice. He was also aware, in a way that was deeply inconvenient and probably unwise, that she was incredibly striking at close range in the morning light, with her braid loose-ended from sleep and her leather bodice slightly loosened at the top 2 laces, and her amber eyes sharp enough to cut through stone. "You will also replace the oregano he sat on," she said. "I will replace the oregano." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned and went back to her woodpile. He heard the axe come down with a single, clean crack. He fixed the latch that same afternoon, working a new iron bolt into the gate's frame with the tools he had in his wagon. He also brought 3 small potted oregano seedlings he had seen at the frontier market in Ridgeback when he made his supply run, and left them on the flat stone beside her gate without knocking. They were gone the next morning. She did not say anything about them. But when he came home from his afternoon rounds at the hives a week later, he found a clay pot sitting on the flat stone on his side of the wall. Inside it were 2 thumb-sized pieces of cut honeycomb from wild bees, wrapped in a clean leaf. They were dark amber and sweet, a local variety he had not yet sourced himself. He tasted one and stood in the late afternoon sun thinking that he had rarely eaten anything better. He left a jar of his own honey on the stone the following morning. She left nothing in response, but he noticed that her garden gate was always latched firmly after that, and whenever he passed the wall she was close enough that it seemed less like coincidence and more like she was keeping a quiet, unacknowledged watch on the property next door. This was, he told himself, not a friendship. It was a border arrangement, a territorial understanding between two people with adjacent land. That was all. He told himself this with great conviction for about 6 more weeks, right up until the night the raiders came. The Greywood frontier had been tense all autumn. Jeremiah had been aware of it in the low-voiced conversations at the Ridgeback Market, in the way the garrison soldiers from Ashford rode their patrols with their hands closer to their weapons than before, and in the deliberate way the orc traders from the clan territories at the forest's edge had stopped coming to market at all. There was a faction in the frontier, loud men with cold eyes, most of them former soldiers from the Ashford garrison who had gone civilian but not peaceful, who had been pushing hard on the garrison commander to formally declare the Greywood a human-exclusive settlement zone. It was the kind of language that led somewhere dark, and it was gaining traction in the way that bad ideas gain traction when enough frightened people hear them repeated. Zora Thunderroar, alone on her property at the forest edge, was the most obvious target for everything that language implied. Jeremiah woke at 2 in the morning to Biscuit going absolutely frantic, barking, throwing himself at the cottage door, making a sound he had never heard the dog make before, a high, urgent, not playing baying that had Jeremiah out of bed with his boots half on before he was fully awake. He grabbed the short woodcutter's axe he kept beside the door and went outside. He smelled the torch smoke before he saw the light. There were 4 of them on the Thunderroar side of the wall, torches in hand, and one of them was trying to light the dry thatch that had gathered at the base of her gate. Jeremiah could hear them talking in low, vicious voices, the kind of men who felt brave in the dark in groups. He did not hesitate. He went over the wall in one motion and landed on the other side, and he was already shouting before the first man turned around, a full-throated, furious shout that cracked through the darkness like a whip, and Biscuit came over the wall right behind him, 70 pounds of furious dog, and the combination of noise and incoming animal in the dark was enough to send 2 of the men back several panicked steps. But 2 of them did not step back. And then the longhouse door came open, and Zora Thunderroar came out of it. She was carrying a short-hafted war spear in one hand and nothing else, and her expression in the torchlight was so utterly, perfectly cold that the man nearest to her took a full running step backward without appearing to consciously decide to do it. She looked at the 4 men. She looked at Jeremiah, breathing hard, axe in hand, standing between them and her gate. She took in the scene in roughly a second. "Drop the torch," she said. Her voice was quiet. That made it worse. The man with the torch dropped it. One of the others stomped it out, which was, Jeremiah thought distantly, probably an instinct rather than a moral choice. "Walk," she said. They walked. All 4 of them fast back toward the road. When the sound of boots on frozen ground had faded, Jeremiah stood with his axe and his panting dog and looked at Zora Thunderroar across the 10 feet of her yard. The night was cold. His breath was fogging. His heart was hammering against his sternum in a way that had less to do with the confrontation and more to do with the fact that she was looking at him with an expression he could not read in the torchlight, something that was not anger and not warmth, but something between the two, like ground that might be solid or might be frost-covered mud. "You came over the wall," she said. "They were trying to burn your gate." "I heard." She paused. "I was awake, I would have handled it." "I know," he said. "I came anyway." There was a silence. Biscuit padded across her yard and sat at her feet, and she looked down at him the same way she had that very first day, with that complicated, half-defeated expression that was not quite a smile. "Come inside," she said, "before you freeze." It was the first time he had been inside the longhouse. It was larger than it looked from outside, built with the long bones of Greywood timber. The walls hung with orc clan work, woven panels in deep reds and earth colors. A rack of weapons above the hearth that was purely functional and not decorative. An orc clan banner on the far wall in faded green and copper. And a low shelf lined with small carved bone figures that had the look of memorial pieces. The space was spare but not cold. A fire burned in a wide stone hearth, and the room smelled of pine smoke and a dried herb that he thought might be sage. She set her spear against the wall and put water on to heat without asking whether he wanted it. He sat at the heavy plank table and watched her move through her own space with the economy of a person who had lived alone long enough that she had compressed her motions to exactly what was needed and nothing more. She moved the way she held a weapon, absolutely sure of herself, and aware of exactly where every part of herself was at all times. She set 2 clay cups on the table and sat across from him, and for a moment they just breathed together in the warm room. "Those were Haverson's men," she said. "The former garrison captain. He's been building his little faction all summer. He wants the frontier declared." "I know," Jeremiah said. "I have heard the talk in Ridgeback." "Then you know he will not stop with a scorched gate." He looked at her. Her face was composed, controlled, but there were things moving in her amber eyes that composure could not quite contain. "What will you do?" he asked. She poured the hot water, added dried herbs from a tin box, pushed a cup toward him. "I will not leave," she said. "This is my land. I built what is on it. My husband's name is on the deed beside mine, and I will not dishonor it by running." She said it flatly as a fact, and he believed her completely, and the thought of what that meant, this woman, alone on this land, against a man with a faction, and a mission settled in his chest like a cold stone. "Then you will have trouble," he said. "I have always had trouble," she said, and something shifted in her voice, not quite humor, but a long familiarity with difficulty that almost sounded like it. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "My name is Jeremiah Winslow," he said. "You probably know that from the deed registration. I know your name, and I know yours, but we have not properly said them to each other." She looked at him across the steam of the cups. "Zora Thunderroar," she said, as though she expected him to react to it the way most people reacted to it, with either practiced neutrality or poorly hidden unease. He nodded. "It is a good name," he said simply. Her eyes moved over him in a way that was slower and more deliberate than any look she had given him before, and he felt being actually seen, like 2 hands pressing flat against a surface to test whether it would hold. "Go home, beekeeper," she said at last, but it was not unkind. He went. He thought about her for a very long time before he slept. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the architecture of the space between their properties. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. But one morning, Zora was mending the crumbling section of the shared stone wall from her side, and Jeremiah came out to do the same from his, and they worked for 2 hours in companionable silence, passing a mortar bowl back and forth across the top of the wall without discussion. And when the section was rebuilt, she set 1 large field stone on top of the finished work as though marking a boundary, and he understood that the boundary was a different kind than the one that had been there before. She began to leave things on the flat stone more regularly. Not always food, sometimes a folded note with information about local weather patterns, or a list of plants that flowered well in the limestone meadow, written in her broad, decisive hand. He left things in return, small, useful things. A replacement awl when he noticed her old one was bent, a tin of rendered beeswax for her boot leather. Once, a single jar of his best amber honey with a note that said only, "For you specifically, not as a trade." She never mentioned the note. But when he passed close to her side of the wall 3 days later, she was wearing boots that had been recently and very thoroughly conditioned, and he thought about the beeswax and felt absurdly pleased with himself. Biscuit continued to be the unofficial ambassador of their relationship. He could not quite be kept from her yard. He had apparently committed to a project of wearing down her resistance through sheer consistent affection, and she had stopped trying to send him back the moment he crossed the wall. By November, Jeremiah would look out his window and see Biscuit sitting in Zora's yard while she worked, solid as a furry stone at her feet, and she would not push him away. Once, coming to retrieve the dog in the early evening, he found Zora sitting on her low front step in the cooling air with Biscuit's enormous head in her lap, one of her powerful hands moving absently through the dog's shaggy fur, and she was looking out at the Greywood tree line with an expression that was completely unguarded, open, and quietly sad in a way that the public-facing version of Zora Thunderroar would probably have taken as a profound affront to her reputation. She heard him at the gate and the expression shuddered instantly. She straightened. Her face returned to its controlled lines. He said nothing about what he had seen. But he thought about it for days, that small, unguarded quiet, and what it meant to be a person who had to be fierce all the time, alone on a frontier with a dead husband's name on a deed and men trying to burn your gate in the dark, and who still had a softness in her when she thought no one was watching. The thought of her having no one to be soft with made him ache in a way he did not have a good word for. The Haverson faction moved in earnest at the first week of December, when the Ridgeback Town Council convened to hear a formal petition. Jeremiah heard about it from the miller's wife when he went for his grain supply, and he went to the council hall that evening, arriving just as the session was becoming ugly. Haverson was a large, florid man in his late 40s with a former officer's bearing and the very specific kind of confidence that comes from having spent years as the biggest fish in a shrinking pond. He stood at the council floor with 3 of his men and presented his petition with the calm of someone who had already counted his votes, a formal request that the frontier's Greywood land grants be reviewed and that those held by non-human settlers be subject to a special board of review, which everyone in the room understood to mean revoked. Zora was not at the council meeting. She had not been invited to it, which told Jeremiah everything he needed to know about how much of this was already arranged. He stood up. He was not particularly imposing. He was of medium height, lean and work-hardened from a life of keeping hives and managing land, with brown hair and gray eyes and hands that were permanently scarred from years of burns and small cuts. He did not have Haverson's officer's voice. What he had was a very complete and specific anger, and he let it shape his words into something simple and difficult to dismiss. The deed to the Thunderroar property was registered in Ashford under the Frontier Land Act, he said. That act does not distinguish by race. If you want to revoke it, you will need to overturn the act itself, which means a hearing before the regional magistrate in Bracton, not a Frontier Council vote. I'm also happy to note for the record that I was present at the Thunderroar property 3 weeks ago when 4 men with torches attempted to burn the gate, and I can name 2 of them who are in this room right now. The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that means no one knows what to do next. Haverson looked at Jeremiah with eyes that filed him carefully under a specific category of problem to be dealt with. The beekeeper, he said, which was somehow both accurate and contemptuous. The beekeeper, Jeremiah agreed. Who knows the Land Act, and who knows his neighbors, and who will be at every council session you try to hold on this matter, until you find a legal basis for it or you stop. The petition did not carry that night. 2 of the councilors who had been on the fence quietly changed their position when Jeremiah mentioned Bracton and the magistrate, because neither of them wanted the kind of scrutiny a regional hearing would bring. Haverson left without speaking to him. The 2 men Jeremiah had identified from the gate incident left faster than Haverson did. Outside, in the freezing Ridgeback night, Jeremiah stood beside his wagon and breathed cold air and felt the particular hollow exhaustion of having been brave in public, which was always more draining than being brave in private. He unhitched Biscuit from the wagon ring, clipped his lead on, and started for home. He was 2 miles from Ridgeback when he heard hoofbeats behind him, and his shoulder blades tightened, and then Zora Thunderroar rode up alongside him on the dark road on a coal-black horse he had not known she owned. She reined in and looked down at him. She had been at the council hall. She had come to stand at the back, to hear it without being seen, and she had heard all of it. He could tell by the way she was looking at him. "You said my name in there," she said. "I mentioned the property," he said. "You could have been made an enemy of the whole Haverson faction tonight." "I was made an enemy of the Haverson faction when I came over the wall with an axe," he said. "At least tonight I was dressed." The night was very cold. The road was silver under the moon. She looked down at him from horseback for a long, measured moment, and then she reached down and offered her hand, one powerful forearm extended in the clear, direct way that, he would later understand, was an orc gesture of claiming an ally, of saying specifically and without ambiguity, "You are mine to protect." He took her hand, and her grip was powerful and warm, and she held it for 2 seconds and released it. She did not say anything else. She turned the horse and rode back toward the Greywood, and he watched her go, and Biscuit watched too, and the dog made a soft sound that was almost plaintive. "I know," Jeremiah told him. He had been managing the complicated knot of his own feelings about Zora Thunderroar for roughly 8 weeks by this point, with moderate success, in the way that you manage a fire when you do not have access to water, by keeping a careful distance and not adding fuel. The care he took not to let it show was considerable and exhausting. She was, objectively and by any measure he had, extraordinary. She was fierce and deliberate and startlingly capable, and she had a mind that was always working 3 steps ahead, and she had a dry, spare humor that she deployed very rarely and which hit like a physical impact when it came, and she was beautiful in a way that was not soft or decorative but alive. All the beauty of a storm system or a river in flood. The kind of thing you look at knowing full well it could destroy you, and finding that makes it more beautiful rather than less. And she was a widow, alone on her land, who had built everything she had from the ground up since her husband's death. He was careful with that. He was careful about her. He was so careful, in fact, that it did not occur to him that she was not being careful at all. It became apparent in mid-December. He was working his hives one afternoon. The bees were dormant in the cold, but the hive structures needed winter reinforcement, and she came around the meadow's edge with her spear over her shoulder and Biscuit at her heel, which had become such a common formation that he barely registered the dog. He registered her, though. He always registered her. She stopped 10 feet from the nearest hive and watched him work. "Come closer," he said. "They will not sting in December. They barely move." She came closer, but what he noticed was that she stopped very close, closer than she usually stood in conversation, closer than the hives required, and she was watching his hands move over the hive frame with an attention that was not about the bees. "Tell me how it works," she said. So he did. He talked about the hive structures, the overwintering clusters, the way the bees kept each other alive through the cold with nothing but their own heat, and she listened in that complete way she had, not just hearing but actually taking it in, storing it, turning it over. And as he talked he became gradually, uncomfortably aware that she was watching his face and not the hives. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, but she did not look away. He was standing beside her in the meadow with frost on the grass and pale winter sun overhead and the Greywood tree lined dark beyond the meadow's edge, and she was standing close enough that he could smell the pine and sage of her, and she was looking at him with those amber eyes in that direct, deliberate way, and he thought, oh, he had been careful, she had not been. "Zora," he said. "Beekeeper," she said. "You know my name." "I know your name." He looked at her. She looked at him. Biscuit sat between them and looked back and forth with an air of profound satisfaction, as though he had planned this. "I do not know what the right thing to do is," Jeremiah said honestly, because she was Zora Thunderroar and she deserved honesty. "I am your neighbor. I am a human man on an orc widow's property. There are already people in this frontier looking for reasons to make trouble for you, and I do not want to be a reason. I decide what trouble I take on," she said. "I know that. Do you want to be a reason?" She asked, and it was the most direct question he had ever been asked in his life, and it landed square in the center of him like a stone dropped in still water, and the rings of it spread outward and kept going. "Yes," he said, because there was no other true answer. The first time she kissed him it was not soft. It was deliberate and direct, and she brought it the way she brought everything, with full intent, both her hands framing his jaw, and the faint, smooth edge of her tusks against his chin, and he was glad of the hive behind him because he needed something to lean against. When she stepped back, she looked at him with those amber eyes and the complicated almost smile that had been winning the battle more and more often lately, and he thought he had never in his life been looked at with that quality of attention, like he was something she had chosen, deliberately, from everything available, after a rigorous accounting. "I need to think about this," he managed. "You already said yes," she said, and turned and walked back through the meadow with Biscuit at her side, and Jeremiah sat down on the hive bench and stared at the winter sky for a considerable amount of time. He thought about it. He thought about it with the same seriousness that he applied to complex hive decisions and difficult terrain. This is what you have. This is what is at stake. This is what you could lose. This is what you could gain. He thought about the Haverson faction, and what a relationship between the human newcomer and the orc widow would hand them. He thought about the clan territories in the deep Greywood and what Zora's clan, 6 years absent, might make of this. He thought about what it meant to be a man who had spent his adult life being quietly, completely alone, and who had found, in the most unlikely possible neighbor, someone in whose company he was not alone. Then he stopped thinking and went next door. She opened the gate before he knocked and let him in with the expression of someone who had known he was coming and had spent no time wondering whether he would. Inside the longhouse by the hearth, with the winter wind outside and Biscuit asleep on the stone floor, he said, "I have thought about it." "And?" she said. "I want you to know something first," he said. "I'm a beekeeper with a cottage and 6 months of savings and 100 hive frames and that dog. I am not a wealthy man or a powerful one. I cannot offer you a great deal in practical terms. And I am aware that you are a woman who has built everything she has with her own hands and does not need practical offerings anyway. But I want to be here. I want to be in your life in whatever way you will allow. That is what I have." She looked at him for a long moment. "You think I want wealth or power from a man," she said. "No," he said. "I think you want someone who will come over the wall when it matters. I just want you to know that is all I have." Something moved in her face, old, private, difficult. She crossed to him and put her hands on his chest, and he put his arms around her because it was the most natural thing he had ever done, and she leaned her forehead down to his, and they stood like that in the firelight with the winter outside, and the weight of both their solitudes between them. And it was like two tectonic forces coming to rest against each other, not grinding, but settling. Finding the shape of each other. "Stay," she said into the quiet. "Yes," he said. The news of it reached Ridgeback approximately 3 days later, which was roughly how long things took to travel on the Greywood frontier. It reached Haverson in 4, which was how long it took for him to decide what to do about it. It reached the Orc clan territories at the Greywood's deep edge in 2 weeks, which was how long it took for the clan's nearest trade representative, a broad, silver-haired orc woman named Varka, to make the ride to Zora's property with her 2 sons and a riding escort. The visit from Varka was not hostile, but it was not simple either. Jeremiah was introduced at the gate in the clear winter morning, and Varka looked at him with the kind of specific, calibrating attention that Zora used, and that was apparently a clan characteristic: weighing, measuring, assigning value. She spoke to Zora in the clan tongue, which Jeremiah did not understand, and he stood patient and straight at Zora's shoulder and did not try to fill the silence with noise, which was apparently the correct choice, because when Varka switched to the common tongue she spoke to him directly. "She is Thunderroar," Varka said, as though this explained the whole of everything, and possibly it did. "I know," Jeremiah said. "Her husband was a great man." "I believe it," he said honestly. Varka looked at him a long time. "What are you?" she said. Not unkindly, it was a genuine question about category and type, a question about what kind of thing he was. "A beekeeper," he said. "Her neighbor, someone who wants to be worth the trouble." Varka made a sound that was not quite a laugh and looked at Zora. Something passed between them in amber eyes and silver ones, and then Varka spoke in the clan tongue again, briefly, and Zora's expression shifted in a way that Jeremiah could not fully parse, but that looked, from the outside, a great deal like acknowledgement. Varka and her escort left before noon. Zora did not explain what had been said, and Jeremiah did not ask, but she stood at the gate after they had gone and looked out at the road with a complicated expression, and then she turned and looked at him and said, "She said you do not stand like a man who is afraid." "I was afraid," he said. "But you did not stand like it," she said, and there was warmth in her voice, real warmth, the kind she rationed and never wasted, and he felt it settle over him like a second coat. January was the hardest month on the Greywood frontier, and they spent it learning each other in the sustained, unavoidable way that winter forces on people who have decided to share their time. He spent most evenings in the longhouse by her hearth, because she had the better fireplace, and he was honest enough to admit it. They ate together, and she was a better cook than she seemed from the outside. She had learned frontier cooking on top of clan recipes, and the combination was unusual and very good. And he brought honey, and she used it in ways he had not imagined, and he wrote down some of what she made in the small leather journal he used for hive records, which made her look at him sideways with a particular expression that was mostly amusement and something tender underneath. They talked. They talked the way two people talk when they have both been alone long enough to have a serious backlog about the work, about the land, about what they had each come from and where they thought they were going. She told him about her husband, Keth, carefully, without armor, which he understood was something she did not do casually. She told him Keth had been big-voiced and kind, and had believed, genuinely, that the frontier could be a place where orc and human settlers built something together rather than taking turns trying to take the land from each other. She said it quietly and he listened fully, and at the end he said nothing except that he was sorry, and she looked at him and said, "Yes, you actually mean that," in a voice that said this was not as common a thing as it should have been. He told her about the lowlands, about the 10 years of keeping hives on leased land and paying someone else's family for the right to work, about the specific, grinding quality of a life where you did the work but someone else held the deed. He told her about being a man of no particular importance, in a place where importance was a currency he could not earn. She listened to this with her arms crossed on the table and her amber eyes steady, and when he finished she said, "You are important here," with a simplicity that made his throat tighten. In the evenings she sat with Biscuit's head on her feet, and sometimes she braided rope or maintained her weapons, and sometimes she read, using a copper-framed magnifying glass, because she would not admit to him for 2 more months that she was slightly farsighted, and he worked on his hive plans for spring at the other end of the table, and the silence between them was the warm, full kind of silence that is only possible between two people who are not afraid of each other. He kissed her properly for the first time in her longhouse on the night of the first deep snow, when the Greywood was buried white and the world was reduced to the warm circle of the hearth, and she kissed him back with both hands in his hair and the intensity of a woman who had made a decision and was executing it completely. Afterward she rested her forehead against his temple and they breathed together in the fire-lit quiet, and he thought he was not sure he had a word for what he felt, and then he realized the word was home. Haverson moved in February, and he moved with more sophistication than torches and night raids. He filed a formal complaint with the Ashford garrison commander, claiming that the Thunderroar property deed had been signed under the Frontier Land Act, but that Zora Thunderroar, as an orc national, could not legally hold property under a treaty provision that had been quietly written into the Act's original text and had never been publicly enforced. He also filed, and this was the piece that made Jeremiah's blood go cold when the messenger arrived with the papers, a complaint against Zora specifically, claiming that she had threatened garrison soldiers during the November incident at her gate, which was the 4-man arson attempt that Haverson was now framing as an official welfare check. The garrison commander, a tired, cautious man named Breck, who did not particularly share Haverson's ideology, but also did not want the trouble of opposing him, scheduled a formal hearing at the Ashford Garrison Hall for the first week of March. The summons to the hearing included a travel order, Zora was to appear and to remain in Ashford pending the hearing's outcome. It was the kind of procedural language that could mean anything, and in the Greywood frontier in March, it meant that if the hearing went badly, she would be out of her home before the spring thaw. Zora read the papers at her table with an expression that was absolutely composed and absolutely furious in equal measure, which Jeremiah had come to understand was her particular kind of controlled rage, the surface still, the current underneath fast enough to cut stone. "I need to find a land law advocate," she said. "There is one in Bracton," he said. "Merritt Dunn. She is expensive and she is good and she handled the Faro land case 3 years ago. I have been writing letters." Zora looked at him. "When did you start writing letters?" "When I came home from the council hall in December," he said, "and more urgently after the Varka visit. I did not tell you because I did not want to make it a larger thing than it needed to be yet." "And you were going to tell me." "When I had someone worth telling you about," he said. "I have Merritt Dunn. She will come for the hearing." Zora was very still for a moment, then she said, "You did that without being asked." "You would not have asked," he said simply. She looked at him for a long time. He watched her face, the composed surface, the current underneath, and then something that surfaced through both of them, real, undisguised feeling moving in those amber eyes like weather coming. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was not the clan ally gesture from the road. This was different, slower, full of something he could not name but felt in his whole chest. "Come with me to Ashford," she said. "To the hearing." "I was already planning to," he said. The ride to Ashford took 2 days on winter roads. They went on horseback, Jeremiah borrowing the miller's spare horse and tying Biscuit's lead to the saddle ring, and Merritt Dunn joined them on the road from Bracton with her leather case of documents and her severely competent expression. Merritt was a small, bird-like human woman of about 50 who had spent 30 years fighting land cases across the frontier, and who had, Jeremiah suspected, won most of them through a combination of iron memory and terrifying patience. She talked to Zora for 6 hours over 2 road camp evenings, getting everything, the deed, the land act, the timeline of every incident involving Haverson's men, the night of the arson attempt. She also talked to Jeremiah, who gave her his account of the council meeting and the names of the 2 men he had identified. By the time they rode into Ashford on the morning of the hearing, Merritt Dunn had what she needed, and her expression said she knew it. Ashford's Garrison Hall was the largest building in the frontier region's stone and timber, built to serve as both administrative court and fortress if needed. When they arrived, the yard outside was crowded. Haverson had done his work well. He had brought a significant audience, his faction men, a number of frontier settlers who had been convinced that Orc land rights were the source of their various grievances, several garrison soldiers in formal dress. Jeremiah walked into the garrison yard with Zora at his side and did not let himself think about the crowd. He looked straight ahead. She walked beside him with her spine absolutely straight and her jaw set and her amber eyes level, and the crowd parted for them with the specific, involuntary space that Zora Thunderroar generated wherever she went, the reputation like thunder, moving through the air before her. Inside, the hearing began in the proper, dry, procedural way of such things, with Commander Breck at the bench and Haverson's advocate presenting the treaty provision argument. It was a real argument. There was genuinely a provision in the act, written in language obscure enough that it had never been tested, and Haverson's advocate presented it with the confidence of someone who had found the correct lever. Merritt Dunn rose and dismantled it with the patience and completeness of a woman who had expected exactly this argument and had been reading cases all week. She presented 3 prior land judgments from the regional magistrate, showed that the provision in question had been explicitly struck from the enforced language in a ruling 6 years prior, and then, with the calm precision of someone delivering the final move in a complex game, read the garrison commander's own language from the welfare check report, the one that described the November visit to the Thunderroar property, which Haverson's men had filed, and which, as it turned out, contained nothing that described any threat from Zora Thunderroar, and everything that described an approach to a property in the dark hours with combustible materials. The hearing was not going the way Haverson had planned. Jeremiah could see it in the man's face, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in the jaw. And then Haverson stood without being recognized by Breck and said loudly, for the crowd and not the commander, that the real issue was not the deed at all, but the fact that an orc woman on human frontier land had taken a human man into her home and her bed, which was a violation of the natural order and an insult to every human family trying to build a life on the Greywood frontier. The room went very still. Outside, through the garrison hall's high windows, the winter wind moved. Jeremiah stood up. He stood up before Merritt could, before the commander could bang his gavel, before anything else could happen, and the room's stillness shifted to the particular quality of stillness that means everyone is watching. "That human man is me," he said, "and I would like to address it directly." Commander Breck looked at him with the expression of a man who sees incoming complexity and is deciding whether to try to outrun it. "That is not a legal matter before this hearing," Breck said. "It has been raised in this hearing," Jeremiah said. "With a crowd present, I would like 30 seconds. Breck looked at him. Breck looked at Haverson, who had made the tactical error of sitting down again, as though he had not just said what he had said. Breck sighed in the way of a man who has been overseeing frontier courts for 15 years and has heard everything. 30 seconds, Breck said. Jeremiah turned to face the room, not just the bench but the crowd, the faction men, the settlers, all of them. He was a medium-height beekeeper in a good coat with scarred hands and gray eyes and not a single impressive credential, and he knew it, and he said what he said anyway. Zora Thunderroar has held this land legally and under the Frontier Act for 6 years. She built her longhouse with her own hands on the memory of her husband. She has traded fairly in Ridgeback and kept her property and done no harm to any person who did not first come to her gate in the dark with fire. I moved onto the land next to hers in October. I chose to be her neighbor. I choose it every day. And whatever I am to her or she is to me is no one's business in this hall or out of it, except that you should know that the man standing here to say it is the same man who was at that gate in November, and who has been at every council meeting since, and who will be at every one that follows. That is all. He sat down. The silence had a different quality now. Not angry, not approving necessarily, but something that was more complicated, the sound of people who have been given something to think about. Haverson's petition was dismissed. Merritt Dunn had the ruling in hand before noon, and it included a formal note from Commander Breck that the November incident at the Thunderroar property would be referred for separate investigation of the men who had participated in it, which was the kind of procedural language that told Haverson he had reached the limit of what he could push without consequences reaching back toward him. In the garrison yard outside, in the cold winter sun, Merritt Dunn shook Zora's hand and then Jeremiah's and said to him, with the dry professionalism of a woman who had seen a great many things, "That was effective. Don't make a habit of unauthorized speeches." When she had gone, Zora and Jeremiah stood in the garrison yard while the crowd dispersed. Biscuit was tied to a hitching post nearby and was demonstrating his feelings about the whole proceeding by having sat on the feet of one of the faction men's horses, which the horse appeared to be tolerating with long-suffering patience. Zora looked at Jeremiah with that amber gaze, and he looked back at her, and the winter sun was very bright on the garrison yard stones. "You said every day," she said. "Did you hear that part?" he said. "I heard every part," she said. "You said you choose it every day." "I meant it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something in the clan tongue, a short, specific phrase, low and intent, and he said, "I do not know what that means," and she said, "I know," and left it there, but later, much later, he would ask her and she would tell him, and it would mean, "You are mine to protect and I am yours." They rode back to the Greywood, with Maritz ruling in Zora's saddlebag and Biscuit loping at the horse's heels. And the winter road was long, but neither of them felt the length of it. Spring arrived on the Greywood frontier the way it always did, not gently, but in a series of decisive advances and retreats, frost one morning and mud the next, the Greywood tree line erupting into pale green almost overnight, and the meadow behind Jeremiah's cottage filling with the first clover blooms that his bees came up out of dormancy to find. He opened the first hives of the season in late March, and Zora watched from the meadow edge, which had become her habit. She would not come too close to the active hives, a reasonable caution, but she would stand at the edge and watch, and he had started narrating his work aloud for her, describing what he was seeing in the frames, and she would ask sharp, specific questions that showed she had been thinking about what he had previously told her. She had learned the structure of a hive from the outside in, asking questions the way she approached everything methodically, missing nothing. On a warm April morning, she came to the hive meadow carrying the clan-style beekeeping veil that she had made herself over the winter from one of his spare frames and a piece of gauze netting, and she put it on, and came to the hive beside him and worked the frame alongside him, and the bees moved around her without interest, and she was careful and precise. And he watched her learn a new thing with the focused attention she brought to all things, and felt something in his chest that was so large it was almost structural, like a load-bearing beam. "You made yourself a veil," he said. "Someone is going to have to manage these hives when you are sick or hurt," she said, in the entirely practical way that told him she had been thinking about a long-term relationship with the hives and, by extension, with him for some time. "That is true," he said. "Also, it is interesting," she said, which for Zora Thunderroar was a considerable admission. He reached over and adjusted the veil's edge where it had gapped slightly, his fingers brushing her jaw at the tusk's edge, and she turned her head and looked at him through the gauze with amber eyes warm in the spring light, and he leaned in and kissed her through the stupid veil, which was completely impractical and made her laugh, a real laugh, full and surprised, the rarest and best sound he knew how to produce, and the bees continued their work unperturbed. In May, Varka sent a rider from the clan territories. The message was formal and in the clan tongue, and Zora read it 3 times at the kitchen table before she translated it for Jeremiah. She translated it carefully, choosing each word, which told him it mattered. The clan elders had recognized the situation. It was the first time in 6 years that the clan had formally engaged with Zora since she had chosen to stay on the frontier after Keth's death. The message acknowledged her land holding, acknowledged the winter hearing and its outcome, and offered in language that was very old and very specific in clan tradition, a formal recognition of the bond between herself and Jeremiah Winslow, if she chose to accept it. The clan term for it, Zora explained, was not exactly marriage in the human sense. It was a claiming, a formal declaration that bound 2 people to each other by name, and registered the bond with the clan and all neighboring clans as something protected and real. It was what the clan did in place of the ceremony that human frontier towns performed in the council hall. It was also, she said carefully, what Keth had asked for and she had given him 20 years ago. Jeremiah sat very still with this information. "You do not have to answer now," she said. "I know," he said. "It is not a human marriage," she said. "I understand if you want the human, Zora," he said. She stopped. "Do you want it?" he asked. "Not what I want. What do you want?" She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the longhouse windows, the kind of spring light that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. She had her braid loose, not yet braided for the day, her hair falling dark over her shoulder, and she was wearing the leather bodice and the burgundy shirt and the worn boots, and she looked like herself completely, not performing fierceness or composure, just being Zora. "I want you to have my name on my gate," she said, "beside mine. I want what I had and something different from what I had, both at once. I want you to stay." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your name is the better name," he said. Thunderroar, he said it slowly. Jeremiah Thunderroar sounds insane. She stared at him. Then the almost smile became the actual smile, the full version, which she kept like a rare coin and spent carefully, and which, when it came, transformed her face into something that made his heart press against his ribs. "It does not," she said. "It absolutely does," he said. "The answer to my question," she said. "Yes," he said. "Whatever form it takes, yes." The claiming ceremony was not elaborate. That was not the clan way, and it was not Zora's way. Varka rode from the clan territories with 2 elder witnesses, and they stood in the meadow behind the longhouse on a clear May morning with the Greywood trees in full leaf behind them, and the hive meadow buzzing with busy bees on Jeremiah's side of the wall. And Varka performed the ceremony in the clan tongue, with Zora translating each piece to Jeremiah in a low voice, and Jeremiah repeated his portion in both languages. The clan tongue, taught to him by Zora over 3 weeks of patient, sometimes laughing evenings at the longhouse table, and then in the common tongue. His pronunciation of the clan tongue was, Varka said afterward, deeply regrettable but technically sufficient. The physical element of the claiming was specific. They used a length of copper cord, wound once around their joined wrists, and then tied off at the end with a flat cord knot. And Zora tied it with one hand while he held the cord in place, and he had seen her do 100 things with those hands, and had never watched them with quite this quality of attention. The cord would be removed after the ceremony and the end piece worn as a bracelet or tie ring, a permanent marker of the bond. Zora kept the knot on a short copper ring that she added to the rings threaded in her braid. He wore the knot tied to the leather lace he kept at his wrist. When Varka said the final phrase, Zora looked at him. He looked at her, he thought, I have never been chosen by anything like her. I have never been looked at by anyone with this quality of certainty. She chose me knowing exactly what I am, a beekeeper, a neighbor, a man who comes over the wall when it matters. She chose that. She is choosing me right now. It was the most astonishing thing he had ever been part of. He reached up and touched her jaw, at the smooth line of her tusk, gentle and deliberate, and she turned her face into his hand for one moment before she kissed him full and certain, in front of Varka and the elder witnesses and the bees and the Greywood, and whatever gods presided over the hard, flowering frontier. Varka said something in the clan tongue when they broke apart. Zora translated, "She says you are acceptable." "That is the highest praise I have ever received," he said. Zora laughed, that full, rare, real laugh, and Varka's expression, which had been composed and careful all morning, showed a clean, brief pleasure in it. Haverson made one more attempt. It was summer by then, and the frontier had warmed and opened up, and the Ridgeback market was full and loud. He came with his remaining faction, fewer now. After the winter hearing and the subsequent investigation into the November incident, had quietly removed 3 of his most vocal men from public life. And he came in the market square on a busy trading day with a document he claimed was a new petition to the garrison, and an audience he had not built so much as happened upon by timing his arrival to the Saturday market crowd. He stood in the market square and he spoke to the crowd, and what he said about Zora Thunderroar was not the same legal language of the hearing. It was the older, uglier language, the kind that builds slowly in the dark and then surfaces when it thinks it has room. He called her a clan spy. He said the bond she had made with a human man was a manipulation, a tool to give clan territories a foothold on human frontier land. He said a great many things loudly in a public square, and the crowd, the uncertain, mixed, always slightly anxious crowd of a frontier market, went very quiet. Zora was at the market. She heard it from 3 stalls away where she had been negotiating for seed stock. She came to the edge of the square, and the crowd that was between her and Haverson did the thing that crowds do when Zora Thunderroar approaches, parted. Not with hostility, with the simple, physical acknowledgement of something powerful moving through a space. She stood at the edge of the clear ground between her and Haverson looked at her, and his expression did something complicated. "Say it again," she said. Her voice was quiet, that made it worse. "Say it again to my face." He said it again. He was a man who had spent his life being large and loud in the rooms he occupied, and old habit was stronger than sense. She let him finish. Then she held up her wrist, where the copper knot sat on its lace, visible and specific. "Do you know what this is?" she said. He did not answer. "It is a clan-claiming cord," she said to the crowd, not to him. "It means I have a husband. A human man on frontier land who chose to bind his name to mine in a ceremony witnessed by clan elders. That is the spy's plan you are describing. A beekeeper and a widow and a dog who cannot be kept out of a garden." She paused. "If that frightens you, Haverson, then what you are afraid of is small, and your faction is smaller." The crowd's silence had changed quality entirely by the time she finished. The uncertain, cautious silence had become something else, something that was deciding, the way crowds decide where the edge of a thing is. Haverson looked at her. He looked at the crowd. He made a calculation. He left. He walked out of the market square with his remaining men, and the space he left behind was full of sunlight and market noise, and the smell of fresh bread and horse in summer. And the crowd exhaled collectively, and then, gradually, went back to trading. Jeremiah had arrived at the market square mid-speech, coming at a dead run from the far end of the market where he had been at the cooper's stall, with biscuit tangled in his legs and the copper lace at his wrist and his heart hammering. He arrived in time to hear her final words, and he stood at the market square's edge with his ridiculous dog and watched Haverson leave. Zora found him in the crowd. She walked up to him with her spine straight and her braid catching the summer light and her amber eyes with that current in them fast and certain, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and there was a moment of pure, complete, unadorned recognition between them, the kind that requires no words and does not wait for them. "You ran," she said. "Of course I ran," he said. "I had it." "I know you did," he said. "I still ran." Her expression held the usual complicated internal battle, and this time warmth won completely. She put her hand flat on his chest, over his heart, right there in the Ridgeback Market Square in the summer sun, with half the frontier population as witness. "Mine," she said. It was the common tongue word, but the shape of it in her mouth was the clan word too, the same sound in both languages, exact and ancient. He put his hand over hers on his chest. "Yours," he said. Biscuit sat on both their feet simultaneously, which should not have been physically possible for one dog, but which he apparently managed through sheer force of will and good feelings. Someone in the market crowd laughed. Then someone else did. Then the whole market went back to its Saturday business, and the frontier went on, and Haverson did not come back. The summer was the best summer of Jeremiah Winslow's life, and he was aware of this in the way you are rarely aware of a best summer while you are inside it, which meant he paid attention to all of it. The long evenings at the longhouse table and the Hive Meadow mornings, and the market Saturdays in Ridgeback, and the clan riders who came occasionally from the Greywood's deep territories, who now greeted him by name, and with the spare but genuine courtesy that he understood was real recognition and not performance. He paid attention to the way she moved through her land, the sureness of it, the deep proprietary confidence of a person who has built something from nothing and knows every inch of it. He paid attention to the way she laughed, rare and full, and the way she looked at him when she thought he was not watching, which was with an openness she wore in private that she kept armored in public, and which he understood was something given to him specifically, a gift of the guarded made unguarded. He paid attention to the nights. The longhouse was warm in summer with both windows open to the Greywood night air and the fire banked low, and she was warm against him, and she was fierce in this as in all things, not soft but certain, not hesitant but deeply, deliberately present, as though she had chosen each moment of closeness the way she chose everything, with full intent and no ambivalence. She brought the same full, attentive force to being close with him that she brought to everything she did, and he had never felt anything like it, like being the entire and specific focus of something that had previously been turned on harder problems and larger challenges, and finding that it fit, that she chose to focus here, on him, on this, on the warm dark of the Greywood summer night, with the bees sleeping in the meadow and the dog on the floor and the whole frontier quiet around their joined solitudes. He told her once, lying in the dark in late July, that he had spent most of his adult life certain he was the kind of person that other people eventually found insufficient, not dramatically, not with cruelty, but in the quiet way of being consistently overlooked, consistently not quite enough. She was quiet for a moment after he said it. Then she said, "You came over the wall in the middle of the night with an axe and a dog." "That is a low bar," he said. "For some men, yes," she said. "Not for the kind of man who also writes letters to advocates and speaks in garrison halls and fixes latches and leaves honey with notes." He was silent. "I chose you," she said. "I chose you with all the information available to me. I am a person who makes good decisions." "That is a very confident claim," he said. "Name one bad one," she said. He thought about it. He genuinely could not. "The oregano request was aggressive," he said. "That was reasonable," she said. He sat on it. "Fair," he said. She shifted, and he felt her smile against his shoulder, and the night was warm, and the Greywood breathed outside the windows, and he thought about a life, genuinely a life, not just a season or a year. A long run of mornings at the hives and evenings at this table and years of watching this woman be fully herself in the world, fierce and guarded and funny and warm and chosen, always specifically chosen. And the thought of it was so large and so good that it sat in him like sunlight. Like something his whole architecture had been built to hold, and had never previously been filled with. He told her so clumsily in the words he had available, which were a beekeeper's words and not a poet's, and she listened with those amber eyes in the low summer dark and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I did not think I would do this again." "I know," he said. "It is different," she said. "From what I had before, it is not less, it is different." "Is that all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and there was something in the word, a settling, a closing, the sound of something completed, and he understood it was the truest yes he had ever heard. In August, he did the thing he had been planning since June. He went to the Ridgeback Registry with Merritt Dunn, who was in town for another case, and he filed a property deed amendment, adding his name to the cottage property deed with a specific notation that formally linked it to the adjacent Thunderroar property as a single operating holding under joint management. It was not a dramatic legal act. It was practical. It meant that the two properties, the longhouse and the cottage, the hive meadow and the herb garden, the crumbling then rebuilt stone wall between them, existed officially as one place with two buildings and two names on the deed. He told Zora about it that evening, setting the filed copy on the longhouse table. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at him. "You did not tell me you were doing this," she said. "You would have argued about it," he said. "I absolutely would have," she said. "It did not need to, Zora," he said. "Your name is on my deed. My name is on yours. That is how I want it." She looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes and all the current underneath. Then she reached across the table and took his hand the way she did, full grip, warm and certain, and held it. "You are impossible," she said. "I am a beekeeper," he said. "We are all a little impossible. It is the bees. They make you strange over time." It was very close to smiling and losing the battle heroically. "The dog made me strange," she said, "not the bees." "Biscuit made you strange," he agreed. "Where is he?" They both looked. Biscuit was asleep on the floor with his head on Zora's boot, which he had apparently stolen from beside the door. His tail moved once in his sleep, the slow wag of a dog entirely at peace. "He knew first," Jeremiah said. "He sat on my foot," she said. "He knew," he said. She looked at the dog. She looked at Jeremiah. The smile that had been fighting its way up for 3 seasons now broke all the way through, full and warm and completely unreserved, transforming her face from fierce to radiant in the way of storms breaking into clear sky, and it was directed entirely at him, at Jeremiah Winslow, beekeeper, neighbor, man who came over the wall with the specific, devastating warmth of a woman who had decided to choose someone and had chosen him. "Yes," she said. He knew. Outside, the Greywood breathed in the August evening, warm and full of leaf and sound, and the hive meadow was loud with bees finishing their last long foraging day before the cool came, and somewhere down the road a horse shook its tack, and the frontier went on in its hard, living, complicated way. The two properties with the rebuilt stone wall between them sat in the summer air as one thing now, named for both of them, held by both of them, built and kept and chosen. Jeremiah Winslow looked at Zora Thunderroar across the table in the warm light of the longhouse hearth, at the copper rings in her braid and the fierce line of her jaw and the amber of her eyes, and the copper cord knot on her braid that matched the lace at his wrist, and thought that he was looking at the most extraordinary person he had ever met, and that she was looking back at him with the same quality of attention she applied to everything important, complete, and deliberate and real. He thought about the name board above her gate, Thunderroar, no other name. He thought about how he had read it on the first day and understood it as a warning. He thought about how it was still a warning, and how he had stopped being on the warned side of it, and how remarkable that was, to be on the safe side of a storm, to be the thing the storm chose to shelter rather than scatter. She reached across the table and took both his hands, turning them over in hers, and looked at the old burn scars and the work-hard skin and the copper knot at his wrist, and she held them with the full, easy strength of hers, the hands that had built a longhouse and thrown a spear and braided copper into her hair and made him tea in a clay cup on a cold night, and tied the cord that bound them, and she held them like they were something she was keeping. "Stay," she said, not the way she had said it the first time with the question in it, the way she said it now with no question at all, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had made her decision in full and was not making it again but simply naming what was already true. "Always," he said. Outside, the bees came home,